Our smallness and our geographical isolation are facts. They're what we've got to live with. Let's, like the best filmmakers, take those limitations and turn them to our advantage. I now welcome our wonderful first panellists and hand over to moderator Russell Brown. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Hello, Morena, and welcome to the opening panel of Big Screen Symposium 2013, Who Gives a Damn About New Zealand Film? Well, we all do, clearly. That's why we're here in the lecture theatre on a Saturday morning. Otherwise, we'd be at home listening to Kim Hill or having sex. Although, probably not at the same time. That would be awkward. Well, maybe that's your thing. I'm not judging. This is an industry where we all know everyone's business. But do we know enough about our audience, where they are, what they want, and how to make them love our work? Not just in Pakuranga, but in Melbourne or San Francisco. On the other hand, Melbourne and San Francisco both have about the same population as our whole country. No one talks about Melbourne film or San Francisco film. Why should we expect the world to think that we're special? To think that there is even a thing called New Zealand film? Can we make our isolation and lack of scale an advantage? Or should we consider the possibility that the whole thing's broken and no one wants to say so? We have plenty of time in this session and a panel which has already proved to be quite unruly. If you know them, you'll understand that. And I'll be setting aside a good half hour for comments and questions from the floor. So let us begin. There may be some filmmaker angst. With me on the panel are Rialto's Kelly Rogers, who is not only 20 years into film distribution, but co-owns independent cinemas in Auckland and Tauranga. Knowing what people will pay to go and see is literally his business. Quinton Hita, the producer of Mount Zion, which earned $200,000 on its opening day this year, and went on to become one of the most successful local features ever. We'll look at what went right and any potential lessons from that. Gaylene Preston, who needs no introduction, but gets one anyway. Her current project, the post-earthquake TV drama Hope and Wire, is but the latest in the life of telling our stories in either dramatic or documentary form. And last but not least, Graeme Mason, the outgoing Chief Executive of the New Zealand Film Commission, whose job isn't the worst one in the world, but possibly feels that way some days. What does the almost unburdened Graeme have for us? Well, let's find out. Graeme, is there a problem? Is there a problem with theatrical release for New Zealand films? I mean, in theory it should be a good thing, but the reality is often a very negative start for the films themselves. Do we need to rethink this?
I mean, I think we do. I mean, obviously, we have to think about audiences a lot more. We have to think about how we grow an audience, how we get an audience on board much younger and expecting and wanting to see New Zealand stories in a cinema. Obviously, it's something I think Kelly will have strong views on. I think we have to look at the means of distribution. I think we've been very slow to adapt to VOD, pay-per-view, the windows, all that stuff is going to have to change. So
it's a changing world, and you're saying our assumptions perhaps haven't changed and in tune with that world.
In two things. One, I think that the means of distribution we need to all be cognizant of, but also I do think that we have to really think about a New Zealand audience. And it isn't giving them necessarily what they know they want, because often we surprise, and that's a great thing about that we do and do very well. But we've still got to think, who is the audience potentially for this? And it should vary in size and shape and permutation. But I think, that has been a disconnect. I think Kelly probably would.
Whose job is that to think about? Is that your job as the key funder? Or is it the filmmaker's job? Is it Kelly's job? Whose job is that?
I think it's everyone's job. I mean, certainly I think it's getting to a pointy end where the funders have to really begin to pull people up, because I think if we continue to make films that don't connect, or we can't measure that connection, because that's a different thing. I think often we're making films which are great stories still and do have audiences, but maybe not someone's going to pay $16 or $17 to go and see.
What do you make of that, Kelly? Is it the wrong measure?
I think you've got to look at the value system that we've all been accustomed to, and we've all sort of gone along on this big train and this journey, and that everyone puts up the cinematic release as the big be-all and end-all. And I mean, to be quite frank, if you make a movie, you all want cinematic, theatrical success. And it seems to be the benchmark for a lot of filmmakers, particularly from my industry, and being involved for the last 20 years. But that's kind of changing now, and just because you don't necessarily have theatrical success doesn't mean your film's not a big success. But I think it's a kind of like a paradigm shift and a mind shift, and people to kind of understand that
That's
up
the
front.
reality, though, isn't it? We all know that there have been feature films whose prospects have been permanently damaged by a bad theatrical debut, and there's a few of them.
Yeah, but I mean, and when you drill down to the industry side of it, a lot of the times that we'll do a release, any film, doesn't have to be a New Zealand film, is that we set the value system up in the ancillary by doing a theatrical release. So it's kind of give it a strong outing and a strong window by doing that. So any success from theatrical, it gets predicated and moves into the different revenue streams. Sometimes, you spend a lot of money up front on your P&A, your prints and advertising costs for a theatrical film, and sometimes it really fires. It takes off, and then all the rest of the revenue streams thereafter are kind of taken care of to a degree because your film has got such penetration in the marketplace.
It's
worth looking at turning it on its head, particularly for an audience on a Saturday morning. Rather than looking at it as the negative, oh my God, woe is all of us with theatrical, let's look at the positive. There's great stories, there is audiences for them. I think it's up to all of us to work out how we get to that audience and what that audience is. So I think that's the positive that I think everyone should take away from the conversations over the weekend.
Well, Kelly, I was going to ask you about this. And part of that value system you're talking about is the system of release windows, which does place theatrical right at the top and gives it this great big space. Is that relevant anymore?
Yeah, well, again, I think it's horses for courses. If you have a film which you think has a wider audience or a theatrical audience, you want to maximise that. I mean, as a distributor, my role is to maximise all revenue streams, maximise all revenue streams and get the most out of the film for the filmmaker on behalf of the filmmaker and the production and the investors. Some films are going to be, successful theatrically. Other films, we don't even bother going to theatrical release. I mean, all New Zealand films, we go to theatrical release because, there's a certain expectation there from all the stakeholders involved. And usually, most of the times there's reasonable success right up to, higher success. But what we're finding now is, the DVD market in decline and the video on demand market on the rise. TV's in a state of flux at the moment. All the windows are shifting basically, and they're shifting before our eyes. And, I'm in the business. I'll buy a film, like I went to the Toronto Film Festival last year, I bought a movie. When I came to release it, the value of the movie had changed in the space of 7 or 8 months. And that's because the market was shifting so quickly. And it's all of our roles and our jobs to try and understand that, get our heads around it. It's a really hard thing to try and get your head around because everyone's, downloading and everyone's got different things going on in their lives. And
Is there a case for saying that local films, for whom word of mouth is probably likely to be the most important marketing, deserve and need a little more time to find their audience?
What do you think, Graeme?
Who's going to cut them that slack, though?
I mean, it'd be a great thing if we had a chain of cinemas. I mean, like our counterparts in India do. There's cinemas in Denmark that you can target to play local product. I mean, I think that would be fantastic. I mean, I guess a problem that you've got is cinemas aren't a good use of real estate for the investor. It's not a profitable business either. So even though we all complain all the way up the chain who's taking the money, it's not very profitable.
Gaylene, you've had the opportunity to make a major TV drama in Hope and Wire. You're working in what is clearly the golden age of television. It's probable that more people will see Hope and Wire than if you'd made a feature from the same material. Why do we make feature films anymore?
Well, that's a very good question. Like under that question sits the idea of why make New Zealand feature films at all? And because that question was raised, I had to think about it. And I thought, okay, let's imagine, I'm just talking about the last 6 months. And I'll say, righto, so the local content that I've seen we exclude white lies, we exclude shopping, we exclude utu redux, fantail, gardening with soul, a year on the ice, and there are others. And we say, right, what I, Gaylene Preston, would have seen as a citizen of this, as a Pākehā citizen of this country, I would have seen Go Girls, the Almighty Johnsons, and Shortland Street, in terms of seeing work with actors in it. And then I think, well, you know, everybody here, we're the imaginers of the country. We are the interventionists and the imaginators. And I think, well, let's all imagine what it would be like sitting here now if we hadn't been in the habit of doing this difficult thing, of getting New Zealand films to their audience with varying degrees of success. And then I think, well, actually, I don't have to imagine it, because I grew up, I saw my first New Zealand feature film when I was 29, and that was at the premiere at the St James in Wellington of Sleeping Dogs. I grew up as a New Zealand person interested in the performing arts in a country that didn't have any films. I mean, the film that was made before Sleeping Dogs was, there was Solo and there was Wildman round about that time, but before that it was Don't Let It Get You, which was maybe 15 or 20 years earlier, and then before that there was one about one. And so I think that within my DNA and within my conscious brain and unconscious brain is programmed a European culture that is basically American or British. I can recite Gerald McBoing Boing by Dr. Seuss. I won't do it now. I can, but I could later, you know, if the party gets really good. And, you know, I know endless AA Milne, and I think I share this kind of culture with fellow Kiwis. And I think that because of this, most of us, including our officials, our politicians, right deep in the heart of Kiwi culture, and to the heart of that question, and to the heart of what you've been, to the heart of the questions you've been asking with respect, Russell, is this Kiwi cultural cringe. We are all members of the KKK. And it is the Kiwi cultural cringe that is our main problem as filmmakers, getting our work into cinemas and to the audience. Because the Māori and Pacifica audience, the Samoan audience, they're completely different culture. They want to see their culture on screen. They want to celebrate performance. They're brilliant actors, and you know. And I'm a Pākehā filmmaker making Indigenous films in a world where Indigenous has been redefined in the last 20 years as brown. And so we've now got the continuing problem that we keep taking the first step over and over again because we are constantly undermined politically and bureaucratically, and we therefore keep asking the page one question to ourselves again and again. And I think it would be really great to actually recognise truth and reality in terms of our culture, which is that there's a huge Kiwi cultural cringe that means if you don't have Oscars, they don't want to see it. So yeah, let's not have New Zealand films. I mean, it's only $10 million a year in $1 billion industry. And I mean, I didn't see the last one. I heard it wasn't very good. You know, let's actually just watch stuff on our phones. Thank you.
Let's maybe talk about, you know, where blame might lie. I mean, you mentioned Sleeping Dogs.
I'm not blaming anyone.
My whole school classroom was taken to see Sleeping Dogs when it was released. People have been talking about that film in the context of recent political events. Who's screening it? Who's even promoting it on VOD? I mean, we do actually have a cinematic heritage that if we appreciated it more, perhaps it would feed into people going and seeing new films. Whose job is that?
Utu Deluxe.
Redux.
Deluxe Redux.
It was deluxe too, wasn't it?
Redux is a really good example of our ability when resourced, because it's not an accidental film, you know, that came out of a moment when New Zealand feature film actually, quite accidentally, and under the noses of politicians, kind of found a hole in the fence and actually managed to match public money with private investment. And suddenly, I mean, if you look at the 18 months around the time that Utu was filmed, you will find the classics of New Zealand cinema. But of course, the minute it kind of got cracking, first step taken, brilliant first step, closed down. Why? KKK.
I'm going to go to Quinton now because he's been sitting very patiently.
The KKK question.
This is, I think, a very interesting point, Quinton, that 7 of the top 10 earning New Zealand films have been Maori or Pacifica themed. What's gone right there? Why have those films found that audience?
No pressure. God. This is pure speculation. Two things maybe. First of all, Māori and Polynesian, I think, although you can never generalise, are still close enough educationally, culturally, to be influenced by a little bit of groupthink. And let's face it, when we were at school, this was certainly the case when I was at school, and I'm informed that it's still the case today, Māori kids were the cool ones. And they set trends. And actually, I think there's something to that because, you know, although the statistics, unfortunately, at the other end, when we leave school, we overrepresented in all the worst statistics. But at school, a lot of the time we are setting trends, Polynesian and Māori. I remember when I worked for My FM here in Auckland maybe 20 years ago, and the drive time host, Mike Haru, was so plugged in and influential with that group that we would have retailers from everywhere across Auckland, including High Street, come into the radio station on a regular basis and lay out, and I'd be in the studio with the bro, they would lay out 5 jackets for him, and he'd walk along and say, nah, yep. And they would go away and stock their stores based on that.
I think My FM is actually a really interesting example because it changed radio. It identified an audience that the rest of the radio industry hadn't even known was there, which turned out to be a very big, very important audience.
So I think there's that. And then secondly, within our wider Kiwi culture, obviously Māori culture, it's still a distinct culture within a wider culture. So, you know, and I think even for all the progress we've made in race relations and stuff over the years, I think in wider New Zealand there is still a fascination with the inner sanctum of Māoridom because, you know, although we are overrepresented in all the worst statistics, that's actually still an exclusive group. Well, it really is, because if you want to know and you want to really understand the Māori experience, that's not an open door. You know, you might have to marry into the whānau and peel potatoes for 10 years in the wharekai before you get access to that. So even though in some ways I think a lot of our films that have been successful in Māori films, there is, I think, still a big fascination. So I don't think it's any of those things individually, but in combination,
you had a great,
that would be my speculation.
A great opening with Mount Zion, though. You had the opening that everyone wants to have. Was that in some respect because you had an idea of who your audience was before you started?
Yeah, it was the Brown audience. Yeah, it was. Yeah, and also I think a younger demographic. Just picking up on what everyone else is saying. See, I think when I was growing up, and just looking around the room, we're all in the same sort of era. The only New Zealand music I heard on radio was Split Ends. And actually, as recently as when I worked at My FM, so maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, if you looked at the program schedule at My FM, you'd be lucky at that stage to see 5% New Zealand music.
And music's a big part of your film. Was that another key to the fact that to its success?
Yeah, it was, but I'd like to draw a parallel with the music industry, because the stigma that we're talking about here, right, and I believe that's also the problem. So Māori seem to have an advantage at the moment in that maybe, I don't know, people are more fascinated with Māori stories, sure, but I think that'll have a shelf life. You know, we'll make hopefully 1,000 Māori films and people go, oh, we know that world now, let's move on. So we need to find a bigger solution, because that's not a guarantee for us forever and a day. And to me, the underlying problem is our kids won't go and watch New Zealand films because there's a stigma attached to going and watching a local film.
And that's very interesting. I'm going to go to Graeme on this, because this stigma is exactly what people used to talk about in terms of New Zealand music. But for the last however many years, the New Zealand Music Commission has done things like New Zealand Music Month. And that, I think that stigma is completely gone. I wonder whether in film, and this isn't necessarily a criticism of you, whether you talk too much to the industry as the commission and not enough to the public. You know, is there a case for actually a little more public outreach?
I think there is absolutely a case for that. One of the key things that Gaylene's mentioned, though, is in film in this country, you've pretty much got the Film Commission, you know, crossing everything. It has the budget that it has, and it's spread incredibly thin. So I think something that we have been looking at, for example, is doing much more reach into schools, again, doing education guides, and not to encourage people to come into the sector, because there's a lot of courses doing that, but encouraging people to appreciate the idea of New Zealand films, seeing the stories, hearing the stories. We're also looking at doing a classic Kiwi film festivals idea. Now, not a whole new film festival, road tripping in the right possible ways. Could again be schools, taking some of these classics that Gaylene's talking about. I mean, for those of you who have seen Utu, or have not, I should say, do go and see it. It's incredible to look at something that was made many years ago and how fresh it is and how relevant it is. And I think that would be something for us, instead of preaching to the converted, take it into schools, get it into a social science program, but in that same token to try and encourage that. You know, so I think it's a way that we have to go to try and build an appreciation for our national cinema and voice.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, you know, Russell, because if I look at, I've been paying close attention for 35 years, and I've been looking closely alongside how the Australian film industry has worked, particularly in terms of how they've worked politically and how that's actually worked back out to the Australian audience. Now, I'm not saying there aren't problems with Australian films to Australian audiences, which Kelly would know well about, but what the film industry in Australia was doing from the very beginning, I don't know if anybody here remembers Richard Adams, but he, from the very beginning, used to turn up in his cape and his hat as a cultural commissar, and he'd say, look, the only way you guys are going to get a good film industry is if you make your Prime Minister the de facto Minister of Film. And the Australians have been very good since the 70s at recognising how national art, the making of Australian work, has to be resourced. And the rise of Kiwi music has been a very interesting model, because it worked with New Zealand On Air deciding to keep resourcing Kiwi music onto Kiwi stations at commercial, That's a different KKK. Anyway, commercial Kiwi. And it's been a many-pronged attack that has been resourced by a hell of a lot of money. It hasn't just been one organisation doing it, and I think New Zealand musicians have got much better about talking about it out of the tent. We do a huge amount of talking in the tent. You know, Sparta talks to Sparta and the Film Commission talks to the Film Commission, and here we all are talking together, which is heartening, but we need to be constantly like cracked records.
There is a distribution issue again though, because you're talking about music going up on a radio station, you listen to it for free. We're talking about trying to build a cinema audience where they have to pay $17 in the first place, and if you are a kid, or if you're anyone in this country, and going into Kelly's world, by the time you've gone to the movies and you've bought even a bottle of water, let alone if you do anything else, it's a $50, $100 experience. That is a serious commitment, and that's what we're asking people to do. So we all have to think that at the end. That's a really pointy
What's
end
the
to be.
solution here?
Can I just get back to your original question about, was it 7 of the 10 films?
Yeah.
I mean, from my perspective, working in this business day in, day out for the last 20 years, 7 of the 10 films were all great stories. That's why they were really hugely successful. They're great universal stories, well told and beautifully presented, and you know, the stars aligned, and everyone wants to see them. And you know, I've been
So they succeeded because they were the right films.
They were great
They were good,
stories.
yeah.
They were well told. That, you know, a great story is always going to cut through, and is always going to succeed wherever you put it. It doesn't matter, you know, if it's a cinema audience or a different type of audience, you know, picking up on a different platform. It's always going to work well. I mean, I've handled probably, I don't know, 16, 17 New Zealand films over the last 20 years, and you know, in the first kind of, like, you know, if I split it in like, you know, the last 20 years into 2 lots of 10, say, the first 10, I was quite depressed, really, you know, about the whole cultural cringe thing. I saw it day in and day out, and it bugged the shit out of me, basically. You know, and you know, I've been to the Film Commission various times saying, you know, and particularly this is in Australia, I mean, don't get me started on Australia, they don't want to know about our films. So I was saying, you know, years ago, let's have a fund in a certain, you know, in the production budget of a film so we can actually promote our New Zealand culture in Australia, our closest neighbour. You know, we should all be getting on well. They should be going to see our films. What's wrong with them? You know, and I had sort of, you know, a number of failures there with the New Zealand films. And, you know, what's going on? Why aren't people coming to see it? And I used to feel like I was hitting my head against a brick wall. And then, you know, we had some success with some New Zealand films. You know, I think Scarface was the first one we took off. You know, and it just rocked. And why? It was a great bloody story. It was totally entertaining. You know, it made you zing, and it was just awesome. You know, you wanted to go and see it. The price of the movie ticket, who cares? We're going to go and see it. We're going to tell our friends about it. The whole cultural cringe thing, forget it. You know, this is good filmmaking. And you know, I think, and now seeing it, particularly in the last, say, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years, for me, that cultural cringe, it's kind of gone. You know, because we're talking to exhibitors day in, day out. We're interfacing with the audience all the time. They don't have that anymore. I mean, this is a real positive thing. But what they do want is really good stories. And they don't discern whether it's a New Zealand film, Australian film, South African, American. They want a good story. You know, you're asking them to pay $17, $18, you know, 19 or 22 for 3D. You're getting up the scale at, you know, $25 to $33 for the NT Live stuff that we bring in from New York and the Met Opera and all that thing. You know, it's a lot of money. So
But maybe that cringe, although it doesn't exist anymore with distributors and exhibitors, but I certainly think it's still in play with New Zealand audiences. And, you know, in the discussions I had with distributors when we were talking about distributing Mount Zion, it became really obvious to me, people kept saying to me in roundabout ways, distributors kept saying to me in roundabout ways that if there is such a thing as a guaranteed audience in New Zealand, such as it is, it's a Brown audience. Specifically, if you can turn out South Auckland to come and see your film, distributor's going to make its money back. So I think there is something in that. And then just to qualify your point a little bit, Graeme, when you say that the parallel with the music industry falls down because, in some part, because they were getting music for free. But actually, I remember very clearly when I was working at MyFM, which was the #1 music radio station at the time, and they had a very low percentage of New Zealand music, and then Shea Fu came along and released Come Break My Chains. And with the release of that song, that was on hourly rotate. It was absolutely huge and drove record sales through the roof. So they weren't getting it for free, they were going out and buying it because it was popular. And then we had Niche and Mystic come along, and their records went absolutely sky high. So our kids were going out and buying and paying good money. I know the scale of finance is different, but they were paying money for that product. I just wanted to make that point as well. And that stigma that existed when we were kids, it's been completely obliterated. So until we got all these structural problems, because yes, it will help immeasurably if we can have our films in cinemas for an extra week, an extra 2 weeks. Good luck on that, because it's not structured that way. But if we, at the audience end of things, I think we have to breed a generation of kids for who film is part of their daily diet without the stigma. We should be making films that target what they want, our kids and our teenagers, and grow that audience. They may not be particularly sophisticated films because our kids aren't very sophisticated, but we can nurture them and develop them into sophisticated film goers.
The thing that's changed in music funding in the last couple of years via NZ On Air is that there are more grants being made with smaller budgets. And the industry realised that was what should be done. Prior to that, there had been album grants, which were up to $100,000 in some cases, and it wasn't working. I mean, is there something in that for us, Gaylene? We should make more cheaper films.
No.
In that it lets a lot more people make films. And do you think you would give the same answer if you were 20-year-old Gaylene just starting out?
No. No in both cases. First point, there is under that question an assumption that the money for New Zealand storytelling, the money available, is a finite amount. And we have to look at that assumption as a conscious or unconscious part of this idea that we don't really, I mean, I am talking about Pākehā New Zealand here, that we are not feeling like we really need to express our culture because we're not actually sure what it is probably, and we're partly not sure what it is because we haven't actually, apart from some very particular, spectacular moments, been exposed to any kind of resourcing that allows us to explore what it is on film. So that's one thing. Low budget films are the highest risk films. And of course, every year, like last year, there were 12 New Zealand feature films in the film festival. Most of them found their audience. In fact, all of them found their audience. Most of them, well, 4 or 5 of them had sell-out season that then went into cinemas. All of those were actually, most of them were documentary. One was a low-budget feature. But I mean, in the end, putting out into the market one low-budget feature that kind of makes it's a triumph of amateurism. It's not how to have a film industry. It isn't actually, where are the flagship projects? And I compare us to our Australian cousins who have had film and television flagship projects for the last 30 years, alongside all that. So I don't think low-budget filmmaking, I think my advice to any young filmmaker, any young New Zealand filmmaker is make your low-budget film here because we've got a fantastically supportive working industry that will help you make a bloody marvellous film. And I urge you to go and see the latest one because there's always the latest one that's marvellous and it's Fantail, the New Zealand drama that surfaced from the film festival this year. But I mean, in the end, go to Australia. Get your ass over to a place where you can wake up in the morning and they do it and you don't have to build it. Because some young people associated with,
Yeah, I'm going to totally disagree with Gaylene. I think there should be, I hear where she's coming from, and I think there should be a range of budgets for people to make films for an audience, right from 50,000 to 5 million or more. And the industry is so tough to make a top tier film and to get funding for it. And this is your career. If you made a film for 50, 100 grand and you sold it to 7 or 8, 9 different territories around the world, and you made it for a specific audience, like an international VOD audience or whatever, and you recouped 80% of your budget back or 150% of your budget, guess what? You can do anything you want to do. You can go to the Film Commission, or you can go to Australia, and you can say, look what I did, I actually created this financial and creative sort of beast here, and I made the money back, and it's been really successful. I want to make another one, or I want to make 3 or 4 of them now, and I'm going to start the next one on a budget. I'm going to do, go up in the scales of the budget. Otherwise, we're all sitting here waiting until we make that really wonderful big film, and because you haven't actually been working in the craft, it might not come off to the way you wanted it to make because you haven't been making them.
Kelly, my point is that at the moment, and actually by ministerial decree a couple of weeks ago, it's what we're particularly good at is making the low budget films. But what isn't there, and what you could die trying to do, is make your $5 million film.
Yeah, I'm not
and we have Jeff
with
Murphy, a wonderful filmmaker of New Zealand. There are many wonderful New Zealand filmmakers who really got on their horse and have fantastic film skills. And I mean, Jeff's got a story he wants to tell. It's worth 30 million. How the hell is he going to do that? It's a New Zealand story.
Top tier filmmakers, how do you make that film in New Zealand? So.
It's the same anywhere. Any country's the same.
Yeah,
and for reasons that you probably all can imagine, I get many emails into my email box now from Australia who, guess what, are saying exactly what you just said about New Zealand. And as most of you know, I spent most of my career splitting between London and LA. All my friends in London say exactly the same thing as here.
Yeah, that's
It's
true.
the same story. It's the same in Denmark. Even Denmark, which we all took at the moment, God, I wish I was there. In fact, where is Daniel? But it's like, they still say it. It's tough, and it really is tough. And you have to think about there's also so many people now trying to do that.
Yeah,
The conversation, if you hear some of our filmmakers on Simon Morris decrying the ability to get second or third or fourth films, there's never going to be enough money in any country in the world to support everybody through that tier going up.
You've got to play to your
There just
strengths
isn't.
as well. We're starting a new company in the UK. It's a direct-to-VOD business, video on demand. And, we're talking to filmmakers who are making, for example, football hooligan movies for £50,000. And the level of the quality is amazing. And they'll recoup their budget because you play to your strengths. In the UK, there's a big, solid football sort of hooligan young men market out there. What are they doing? They're not going to the movies. But what are they doing? Let's drill down. They're getting DVDs. They're getting it out on VOD. Okay, what are we playing to our strengths here? Where are our strengths in a sort of similarity or some sort of market here that we can do things like that as well?
Anzac Day. Really, the films and the television and all of the resources around Anzac Day, the New Zealand audience will turn up in droves to look at the Anzac Day.
I think if you speak to Jane Wrightson or myself or some of the broadcasters, you'll find that a lot of people are looking at Anzac Day at the moment.
Exactly. Because there isn't a cultural cringe around that. I think New Zealand filmmakers, young and old, really do grapple with this thing about the audience.
I think Q's point's right about making it cool in schools, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Well, maybe one way of putting it is that if we want the rest of the world to believe there's a thing called New Zealand film, do we have to convince ourselves first that there is?
I think the rest of the world's fine on it.
They don't
They're
have
fine.
quite
No, they
the same
believe that
problems.
New Zealand is cool. They understand it, and they're looking for it. I mean,
And yet, on the other hand, I talked to someone who runs a big science fiction website in the US. She came over here and was talking about The Quiet Earth. It's a cult classic in the US. No one talks about it here. Most people haven't heard of it. When was the last time it was screened in the theatre? Do we need to fix that? Do we need to actually have a heritage?
most of these films, by the way, have been worked on by the Film Commission in various forms over the last period of time and released, for example, on DVD box sets. We do work around the world and here all the time. You know, probably a third of the entire time the marketing department spends at the Film Commission is on film festivals around the world. At least a third.
About putting that film in the cinema is that, you know, Q was saying, cinemas aren't set up to get a really long run for a film. They're not even set up to put on, you know, 5 or 6 sessions like that, because the Hollywood products is coming down the pipe big time into the multiplexes, and they don't want to know about it. And they're so corporate, they don't sort of think about, you know, a filmmaker rings them up. I've got this great film, it's a New Zealand classic, you know, what about it? And they're like, they don't get it, you know. It's like, it's very pre-programmed. It's all the big American hits.
Look at the release schedule. The
release schedule, whatever's number one in America, the weekend is pretty much the same film that goes out in New Zealand, and that's, you know, to avoid piracy and other issues. But, you know, there's a strong independent sector here, and, you know, we put films on a lot and we try to maximise that, but at the same time, you know, like Graeme said, you can pick up this, you know, a beautifully remastered Blu-ray copy. But I think what you're saying is, how do we get more people to realise that's sitting there, that's available, that resource is there? You know?
Yeah. And I think that we have, as Kiwis, we have a great thought always that it must be somebody's job. It must be the government's job. Oh, it'll be the Film Commission's job.
Yeah, that'll be it.
Or it's New Zealand On Air's job. You go, well, actually, it's not the Film Commission's job. If you read the Film Commission Act, there's nothing in it about doing all that shit. It's actually about resourcing a film industry. And New Zealand On Air does have the word culture in its act at the moment. But, you know, it's actually up to us as citizens and as makers and as talkers to actually stop sitting in the slosh houses of Courtenay Place and Ponsonby Road, whinging about
The Film Commission.
the Film Commission in New Zealand, right? Because that's what gets percolated out. The film industry itself, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, after 35 years of close observation, is best at shooting itself in the foot as a group.
Would you like to respond to that?
I mean, I do think it's a dangerous obsession to just obsess about the Film Commission. It doesn't help anybody. I mean, it really doesn't. It doesn't help us, doesn't help you. It's just not a good idea. And Gaylene is absolutely correct. You know, I think hopefully
How much money actually does it have? I mean, it's a little wee dripping tap. There's millions of New Zealand taxpayer dollar going into resourcing international filmmaking in this country. There's how much?
Well, we have a budget of 20 million a year because Spiff came out of us, as you all know. So we have to spend in production 13, 14 million a year.
It's a drop. It's a little leaky tap. It's not worth obsessing about.
I would suggest you all, just as an aside though, I mean, so if you do add in Spiff, obviously, which is available for people in this room, even with those two things combined, it is less than is spent, university, than propping up people going into courses every year for the screen sector. So think that through. You know,
last 2 minutes or so, and then we'll go to questions from the floor. I'm interested in, have you guys all seen Flat 3?
Hey?
So that's really interesting. Who's seen Flat 3?
I don't.
Good.
Sorry,
that
I didn't
fascinates.
hear the title.
Flat 3. Roseanne
Flat
Liang, who's made 2
3.
features.
Right.
Flat 3.
Turns
Flat
around.
3.
We think you said
yeah.
flat tree.
Oh no,
Yeah, we could.
because I'm Irish.
No,
yeah.
we've all seen Roseanne.
Flat 3.
Because that fascinates me. You know, someone who's made 2 features turns around and just goes direct and makes something for virtually nothing. She's got festival interest all around the world. She's got the kind of interest that you would love for your feature. And she's done it in a way that she seems to have really enjoyed, and she hasn't, the focus has been on the work. Is there something in that? And she's made a web series that may well become a feature one day.
Jason Studdard just made a film for almost nothing, which, won a prize in the American Comedy Festival. He's done the same thing. There's a lot of people doing that. I know Bonnie Slater, who looks after Prof Dev for us, said she watched a film the other day which came out of nowhere, turned up on her desk. She says it's awesome, like awesome, and it's including cars and people blowing up and all that kind of stuff. And they've just made it independently, and she said the quality, though, is extraordinary. And there's people all the time doing that.
Those, I mean, doesn't make enough money to enable her to continue to do what she loves doing. I hear your question, Russell, but underlying that is sustainability. You're always going to have, the odd person do spectacularly well. That's the exception, not the rule. And aren't we talking big picture here about something resembling a sustainable industry?
Industry actually implies work, and work actually implies wages. And I want, when I get up in the morning, I want my feet to hit the floor, and my best joy in life is that when those little tootsies hit the floor, they're funded. and they're funded not on what everybody thought they wanted, but on something that I feel really passionately about, that I might have spent some time. They mightn't be funded greatly. Those little feet might actually be getting round about the dole per hour, but there's funding and funded to resource what I want to do, because otherwise I don't get 35 years living in my own home, living in my own country, making my work for Kiwi audiences. And I mean, as soon as you leave home, it's no problem. They just want to touch the hem of your garment. You know, they understand. If you go to France, God. But here, it's huge. It's a huge luxury. But it shouldn't be. It should be that there should be heaps of me.
I guess, from my perspective, hearing that, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? You want the sustainability, and you want to be funded, you want to be recognised for your talents and your craft and creativity. Yeah. But then some younger people, for example, how do you get into that? It's like those doors aren't necessarily just open, and then everyone sits back and kind of, we talked about, film commission bashing. I mean, I totally disagree with that. I mean, that's just bullshit. It's like focus on the story and do what you want to do, tell your story and get out there and do it. So that, and you think, oh, Kelly, it's easier said than done. You go and make a film, So then people are turning to these no-budget and low-budget mediums, and creatively, there are fewer constraints there for them, so they can take more risks. And sometimes it might rock, and something might come out of it, and flip side is, it might be a calling card to go to a different part of an industry and get recognised to get the job. I mean, I'm just trying to tell you guys how to suck eggs, but it's like, I'm open to these different creative, ways of putting budgets together. It must be incredibly hard to do that. But if you've got creativity and you find a vehicle and a format for it, Kelly, there are a lot of people open to it.
I completely agree with you. And I think that the triumph of the New Zealand film culture is that we have been brilliant since 1976 at launching amazing talent, young talent, under-resourced out into the world. And that's why my advice to a young person is to make your first feature here and get to hell out, because the next stage of what you're talking about is not resourced here. If you want to tell New Zealand stories, if you want to work with international, if you want to work with intellectual property that is international property, then you've got a standing start. But if you want to tell your stories your way and they're personal, it's very hard to make that next step, because I come back to this idea that we are an industry that's really good at taking the first step. And over 35 years, I've seen the first step over and over, and we're brilliant at it. Second step, sometimes we've done it, and then whack. How we were doing it is the rug's pulled, and suddenly we're under-resourced again, and that is a political thing.
Gaylene, it's not. It's a size of market. It simply is.
It's a political thing.
Because every country in the world has the same problem. I mean, the budgets, the money that come in here for filmmakers are substantially higher than any other country that I've worked in, any other country I've dealt with, much more than Israel, Denmark. The only exceptions will be France.
Political thing.
So, I mean, I guess the trick though with Gaylene, if we wanted to do it at a reasonable budget, it's just not possible if you think of all the great filmmakers that we want to tell their second, third, fourth story. In a country this size, you can't do it. We have to encourage and support people to go and find additional resources. You're going to have exceptions.
Yeah, but we're just talking about the ability of New Zealand storytelling to be able to have some sort of critical mass. That means we can be making the $3 to $5 million films regularly.
I think it comes down to audience again, because there were 45 New Zealand films in the festival this year across shorts, features, documentaries. We should all be celebrating that. That is an extraordinary thing that people have made independently or with us. We've got to ensure that there's audiences here going to see them. You and I were both at the shorts program the other day.
Yep.
Packed out. Every town it's in, it's packed out. That's fantastic. Now, probably many of you went, or you've got friends who made them, but so you went to support your friends. You talked about them. All those people spread the word.
I mean,
that's fantastic. How many people have been to see all the New Zealand features this year? Yeah, very few. I mean, that's fantastic, but it's really small. We're not talking about our own work. How do you expect anyone else to come and see it?
I also think, in our world with film, the world is shrinking, and people look at New Zealand and they do see the talent there, and it's not as though we're separate from that. I don't think you necessarily need to leave the country to do that, because if you make this little, web short, or it's this incredible fizzing, sizzling thing, all the people, the kingmakers in the world who fund, they'll all know about that, because they employ 7 or 8 people, when all they do every day of their life is to sniff at projects and people all around the world to look for talent. And if you look at it and you sort of boil it down, New Zealand is actually in a really good shape because we're English language. People are always looking for English language projects in the world because they know they can maximise the return on it. And you're going to get tapped on the shoulder, and people will track you.
I've had calls from people who want to work and bring films down here. One's Christine Jeffs, one's Nikki Caro, and one's Taika. Now that's fantastic. Now that probably is the only way for them to keep telling the stories they want to tell at a budget level they want to operate in.
Yeah.
But what they've got to a level of is that they can bring money and people back here, which ultimately is good for everybody. Something we need to do is encourage a lot more cross-fertilisation when those international people come here, meet, the Michelle Savills, the Zem Andawallas, the people coming through now and say, look, there's more, aren't they genius? And how can we help?
So you're saying that those people are emphatically seen offshore as New Zealand filmmakers, as part of a New Zealand film culture?
Absolutely, they are. Internationally, it's seen as this incredible place. We've had more short films in competition in Cannes than any country but France. But are we doing enough to try and encourage those filmmakers when they've been very hot for a moment to see what their opportunities are? And we as a sector, as a whole sector, no. Have we been barging down all the doors when we were on the front page of every newspaper in the world when The Hobbit went out? Everybody now thinks that you can make anything in New Zealand. We need to maximise that.
Is there an issue there that it's all very well to talk about our short films being seen at festivals here and overseas? As a member of the paying public, I'm completely mystified as to where I would see a short film apart from the annual festival.
Correct.
What do we do about that?
Personally, I'd like to have them on broadcast, but I think that's really problematic let's be honest, for the scheduler. It's not a good use of space because the length is wrong and, it doesn't feel it. I get that as a slot problem. We've obviously had great conversations with Air New Zealand. We've got, I think most people are aware, we're looking at a VOD thing to promote and also for filmmakers to maybe make some money from their features and shorts. And I think, interestingly, VOD internationally, the 2 most successful things are shorts and documentaries. On the big VOD system so far. I mean, take out the Hollywood stuff.
You got a view on that, Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you're talking sort of historical to where we are now, and there's a sort of big gap in between. I mean, short films, from my perspective, were there as a stepping stone to go into something else. But a short film costs so much money to make, and you think, well, this is such a great product. How do we get people to see it? And you're right, there are problems because it doesn't easily slot into an easy viewing situation. We do them on Reality Channel, package them up for VOD, do packages with DVD. You can do all that stuff. But again, you just throw that into the marketplace when you're competing with 7 or 8 films released every week. And on DVD, there's probably 15 films released every week. And on VOD, there is no limit. You can put 5,000 films on and just, and then you think, well, how do I find them? And the whole VOD thing's based on alphabetical, it's A to Z. So if you've got a film starting with A, you've probably got a better shot of people picking it up than, which is And that'll change. And it sounds bizarre, just that it's a techno thing. The marketing people haven't caught up with that yet, but they will very soon.
I think Kelly's said something there which is key for everyone to remember. He's talking about 7 or 8 films released every week into the cinemas. So that means in a month you're talking 30 releases. Now, back in my day and your day, Gaylene, when that started, that was not the case. It's also why you're able to get a film in and let it build and find its feet and its audience. It isn't now that the cinema owners are being rapacious or horrible. It's just not possible. And there's a load of films which never get released in this country because distributors or exhibition take a view that they won't work. So I think the latest statistic I saw that in America, which is still the biggest cinema going and film viewing audience, they can consume less than 1% of what is available.
I think I listed...
It's that frightening. You've got to think about an audience because there's 30 other films coming through in your month.
I think in the Cannes Film Festival this year, I think I looked up and there was something like 5,000 films on offer. There are obviously, films from, some little film festival somewhere and they've sort of plopped them in there. But you think, well, how many of those actually sell to distributors, which is, partly the market? And, when you boil it all down, it's the audience. Who are you making that film for? That's the very first question. You've got to really identify the audience and think, there's a strong audience there. We're going to make these films for this audience and give it a go, rather than sort of thinking, people will come to it, it'll be okay. Well, it's not, So it's a tough one.
Never was, never will be.
Right, let's go to the audience. Do we have mic runners? Jolly good. You can ask questions or make statements, but if they're statements, please keep them concise. Jeff. Oh, hang on here. Oh.
Kia ora, Jeff Leland, University of Waikato. I teach film, so I'm interested in what Graeme had to say about the education sector because I do promote New Zealand film, but I sometimes feel it's a bit of a lost cause for my students. Like Russell noted, they have a loyalty to New Zealand music, but not a loyalty to New Zealand film. But I look for areas of positive growth, and one thing that really has been mentioned a little bit is the art house independent sector, but not enough. That is the growth sector in New Zealand. It's now, according to Mark Christensen, more than 30% plus of the New Zealand box office, and there's new cinemas opening all over the place. Dargaville has just got a new cinema after 30 years of having no cinema in the town. Through community effort, you go to a little town like Opanaki in South Taranaki, they're refitting out the everybody's to reopen it. And they are much more oriented to New Zealand film than the multiplexes.
Let's ask the small cinema owner.
I applaud that, and I applaud people, with that growth sector there. To me, it's a simple answer to the question is we're not making films for the New Zealand audience. The art house, there is no art house cinema chain in the UK. People don't go to art house movies there for the geographical reasons. Same in America. Art house is a nasty, dirty word, basically. This sounds really crude and horrible and nasty, but it's the reality is that people don't want it. Occasionally a film pops out and picks up the best foreign language nomination. Ooh, the US distributor might pay, 50 grand to buy that. And they're going to spend, the few $100,000 to buy it. But essentially, people don't want it. And I put that in context with making a film for $3 or $4, $5 million. You cannot make your budget back doing that. So there's no viable industry there. Sure, there's, emissions to that, and occasionally films pop up, but the statistics are so poor. That's why people make films for DVD or VOD or action or violence, because they know there's a strong audience there. And America's just...
a website that Art House Independent, close to 100 cinemas that fit that description in New Zealand.
New Zealand has a really strong, thread for that, and there's some really good, strong independent cinemas for that. Thank God, it's great. It's a really strong industry here, but it's not in the world.
It's also worth here looking at what they're actually programming, because that's the problem. I remember when I still lived in London, and we had a fantastic cinema up the road called Screen on the Green, and there was this association of several of them, and they were famous for supporting films from around the world and great art house movies. And I can remember walking down the street one day and suddenly seeing they had the Harry Potter playing. And the problem, though, is that when you've got 5,000 films, and the art house market, there is a strong art house market, but they put them in for a week or 2 weeks.
Even more concerning, particularly for me as an art house film distributor in Australasia, is that the so-called art house cinemas in Australia have stopped playing art house films in Australia. I mean, what
Because
the
they
hell?
can.
There was two strong chains there, the Dandy chain and the Palace chain. They built their reputations on art house. Why is that? They can't make money on it. In Australia, particularly, you know, the rents are higher there, and the Hollywood studios come out with 7 films every week, and they spend upwards of $2.5, $3.5, $4 million promoting that film. Bang! You know, art house cinemas think, great, we're just going to sit there and the big Hollywood film of that week, by virtue of critical mass in terms of the media exposure and publicity spend, is going to get me a result for my cinema. The little art house guy with his lovely little Kelly rocks up with his art house film, which was just won the Palme d'Or, or you know, the best foreign language film in the Oscars. Yeah, I don't know about that, Cal. You know, it's a bit tough to place it. You know, we've got this big Hollywood film here. We're going to go with them. You know, I just feel like falling through the floor.
Right, we've got the mic up here. Yes, you sir.
Yeah, my name is Greg Parks. I'm a young independent producer. My feeling around the cultural cringe is that the actual existence of the Film Commission over the last 35 years has led to a lack of cultural capitalism. We don't have wealthy individuals in this country who see it as their job to support our culture. So because it's the government's job, as Gaylene alluded to, which means that if I'm going out there looking at individual high net worth people to try and get equity financing for projects, the first question out of their mouth is, why isn't the Film Commission funding it? How big a problem do you see that when, you know, the fact that we've got this mentality that it's the government's job?
Okay, that's a good question. The lack of, when I was talking about utu and the great explosion of New Zealand film between it wasn't for long, it was between 1979 and the end of it was over by 1987, is because actually New Zealand investors have been outlawed from investing in New Zealand film. So if you are a serious investor and you want to invest in New Zealand film, you can absolutely expect to be audited by the IRD. There is an attitude there that is related to those days when New Zealand investors did invest in New Zealand film and it got shut down. So the investors who put their money into utu, only a few years ago, having taken their case right through to the Privy Council in Britain to be allowed the incentive that they thought was legal. So, I mean, within that environment, the few rich people in New Zealand know that basically, I walk in the door, I'm Zorro's girlfriend. I may as well have a mask and a gun, you know, because the film industry has been treated by the interface between political life and investment life as outlaw.
I think he's asking a different question, because I think the trick for my view on private investors is you're either doing it because there's a favourable, i.e. or dodgy tax benefit, or you're doing it because you think you can make money. But the third thing that you're referencing, I think, is maybe cultural investors, that kind of benefactor type idea.
Well,
the rich dentist in the States who puts up all the money.
Both. You know, I mean, you kind of need a bit of everything to have a chance of getting anything. So, yeah, but I do think there is a distinct but I mean, because from a cultural point of view, the Film Commission stands in the way of those investors coming in and saying, well, we have to do it because there isn't anything else. You know, I mean, if suddenly they took away funding from rugby from a government point of view, you know that people would put their hands in their pockets because on the same basis. I mean, they do anyway, even though it is funded up the wazoo by the government. But I think there's become an expectation that it is the Film Commission's job, and there's a disconnect with that $20 million budget and what they see on screen, probably because we do everything so damn well so cheaply, that they think that we don't, you know, that there isn't, I mean, there's not a way to do it constructively financially for them, but also there's no imperative because it's just the government's job. And even if they're doing a bad job, it still their job, and they'll just blame the government.
Thank you. We'll go to the next question, yes?
Hey, I'm Connor. Back to short films, actually. How about, I mean, I guess I'm wondering from Kelly and, well, everybody, how viable short films before feature films in the cinema is. And because I saw, I mean, I know you guys, you do it at the film festival, and I reckon that's awesome. And like, it's, you know, you choose a movie and you happen to see a short film, it's just like, you know, the cherry on top. And I went to Submarine a couple of years ago at the embassy, and I saw a New Zealand short film called Blue before, and absolutely loved it. And I remember going to Pixar films and seeing the shorts before, like years ago, and you know, really loved it. Obviously they're shorter, they're more like 5 minutes and less, and so maybe it's probably, I guess, a duration thing. But you know, what do you guys think about the possibility of short films in the cinema before feature films, international or New Zealand?
Yeah, it's a great idea, but unfortunately particularly those big American directors who make 3-hour films, mean you can't fit the time to put a short film in front of it. And then you go to the exhibitors cap in hand saying, oh, I've got this great short film and we think it'd be totally great with this, you know, New Zealand feature film, what about it? Oh, yeah, it's too tough, I don't know. You know, we can't fit the sessions in, because the exhibitors are all on this grid basically on a Monday morning where they do their session times. And there's another 10, 12, 14 minutes there in front of the 23.5 minutes for ads, you know, and the popcorn and all that. It doesn't work. And so, you know, one way to do it is you could actually monetize it and go to the exhibitor and treat it like an advertisement and compete with Val Morgan, which is the screen advertising company that also puts screen ads in front, and say, okay, well, here's, you know, X amount of dollars to event cinemas or Reading or Independence, and we want the short on. You know,
Does that make sense, Graeme?
It does, but again, I guess if you're going to have to monetise it, if you're going to have to pay to put the short up there, I guess there's only one place everyone's going to look to pay.
Which way is it?
I'm old enough to remember the days when there was time for the national anthem before every film.
Yeah, it's good standing up like that.
Where's the mic there? Oh, good. We have a woman asking a question. Good.
Hi there, my name's Gina Delabarca from the Show Me Shorts Film Festival. You asked where you can see short films. I have a statement and a question. The statement is that you can see short films at the Show Me Shorts Film Festival in cinemas nationwide. So, that's in cinemas nationwide every November. You can also see them for free online every month where we post new short films. I've got a meeting with Hoyts next week to pitch them playing some of our short films that we've curated in cinemas, so cross your fingers for me that that works out. My question is how we can persuade people that short films are an essential part of going to the cinema, and it's part of your feature film going experience, like taking it back in history when that was part of the experience. Is there a way that we can do that?
I think that's a good question, Gina, and I think from an exhibitor point of view, they're the guys that people that make those decisions. If you can make those shorts as entertaining as possible, and they can see the added value part of that, you kind of want, you know, you're winning them over. That just, again, it comes down to the content and the audience. Doesn't matter how long the film is. So.
There's also a slight disconnect, you know, because we encourage a lot of our filmmakers to make shorts of a length that really can demonstrate their range and scope, and the work stands alone, but also leads to future work. So in New Zealand, most of those shorts are significant length, whereas the shorts that we probably all remember back from the day were under 5 minutes. They're probably 3 minutes, whereas most of our shorts, I'm looking at you and Lisa Chaplin, if she's here, most of ours I think are probably 12, 15. So that's a significant thing to put in front of a feature, which, as Kelly said, is 3 hours long. So that's, and that's a problem. I don't know, I haven't worked out how to square that yet.
Gina, can I also say that the website I run, Public Address, has an ideal audience for Show Me Shorts, so do send me all your stuff and we'll get behind it. Having made that complaint, I feel I have to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nick Ward, and I am one of the, I guess you could say, curators of the show of Short and Sharp, so one of the pods where we're looking for short films. And we're out there. I'll just do a little bit of an ad now. Please send us your films. I want to read the scripts. The applications are there up on our website, and we've got a Facebook page as well. There's the ad over. I read a lot of scripts last year, and just coming off what Kelly said there, please send us some scripts that are not therapy. You guys go and have therapy, but send us some scripts that are first and foremost are scripts that think about an audience and not necessarily entertaining them, but taking them somewhere on a journey. I really need to see more of that. Some of the scripts we saw, and I'm going to say this out front, some of the scripts we saw last year were really, really, really of a standard that embarrassed me slightly. So please send us some scripts that you have thought about telling a story. And that is all. And as Kelly said, yeah, let's try and make that either scared, laugh, fall in love, do something like that.
If you do have anything else to say, please take it up with these guys, argue amongst yourselves, enjoy the